Okay, what is hypercharge compared to the electromagnetic charge? It's just another charge. So the charge is it's just some property that we assign to a particle, and hypercharge is a different property.
Does it involve attraction?
Yeah, there could be, for hypercharge, there can be attraction or repulsion.
So it's a plus, a minus, and a zero.
Yeah, and you can even have you can either have half integer values.
Does it interact with electromagnetic charge?
So, well, the charge itself is a property of the particles. So there are some particles that have both charges.
But they're not the same category of thing. I mean, electromagnetic charge and hypercharge are not electromagnetic in some fashion.
Well, electromagnetic charge, particles that are electromagnetically charged experience electromagnetic force. But they're really properties of the object. Like you could think of it, like a characteristic of a particle.
If you have a hypercharge, does that mean you also have an electromagnetic charge?
Not necessarily. So the neutrino is a particle that has a hypercharge and not an electromagnetic charge.
Okay. All right.
Okay, let's see. Can hypercharge be -1 or 1 or 0? So it can be, the numbers that I used are not, it depends on conventions, but it's also quantized. So I think the standard, in the standard textbooks, you'll see it can be, I think it's in thirds. So it can be a third, minus a third, 2/3. But you could think of it, I use -1 and 0. Or I use 1 and 0, I think. But it's the point is it's quantized and it has to be conserved if something interacts. Okay, let's see. What is the alternative to longitudinal polarization? So longitudinal polarization is something that only particles with mass have. Things like the photon do not have a longitudinal polarization. What they have is often called helicity. This is the technical term for it, and it's basically it's spinning in. You can think of it as the right-handed and left-handed thing, right? Whereas longitudinal would be, instead of I'm spinning in this direction or that direction, I'm spinning in this direction, right? And that's something that it only makes sense if you have a mass. Are there any other? I can keep going through this list.
We really don't know how protons spin, is that right? We don't know what's going on.
So, the question is, we don't really know how protons spin. I think we understand a great deal about how they spin. There are mysteries associated with how the things are aligned within them. And so, and this is something that I don't think I'll talk about, but it would be good for you guys to get a lecture on that. And this is a whole other thing. But so we have these quarks within, I'll talk about some of this today, but there are quarks within a proton, and it looks like they're all in a very straight line, okay, or you could think of it like that. And they behave like I said, they're in a very straight line on average. And this is a mystery. You wouldn't expect this to happen. You would expect them to sort of be random, and they're not like this, okay? And so this is something that a lot of people work on. They're trying to understand why this is the case. And so that is something that we don't understand very well. But the spin of the proton is something that given what we know about the quarks inside of it, and given that it has this weird arrangement, then we can predict it. We can predict it accurately.
But the proton is not really spinning like a top. Spin is just like color, or it's just a name of colors.
So with the elementary particle, spin is just a characteristic. It's like charge. With the proton, that's not the case because the proton is made of other things inside it. So you can actually get some spin from the things inside of it spinning. Yes. So the protons are very different because they're made of other things. So because they're made of other things, they behave like objects that were more chemical. Well, everything's quantum mechanical. So there's some, it's not really an object. It's an object. It's a number of objects being held together by gluons. And so the radius that you measure is really the first time that force becomes strong. And that's a quantum mechanical effect. So that can change depending on, it only has a meaning on average.
So how should we think about time
So, yeah, so it would, except that some pions are different types of quarks. You have enough quark and down quark, they can't annihilate each other. But some pions are the same quark, and so what you have to say is there has to be some other difference to prevent them from annihilating. And so they have different colors, for instance, or they have different types of spin.
Okay, so is it, the same part, the same part, cannot annihilate it.
It can't be an exacting particle, or could annihilate. It has to be different in some way.
It has to be different to survive and to last.
Are there any other questions about? So were people happy with the size of the Earth estimating?
Yes, you want a question first. If you could have any question answered today by some deity, what would it be?
Well, maybe we'll wait till the last lecture. Question back there?
Right, well,
It was very good that I'm referring to the first part of your last lecture 2 weeks ago.
Right.
And supposedly the Enrico firm was supposed to be quite good at approximations of,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
for example, the famous question of other quote-unquote piano tuners
Right,
in
yeah.
Chicago. They went about it by chopping down from the population of Chicago and narrowing it down to really a precise number.
Yeah.
It still blows me away.
Yeah.
So how did you go about it?
Yeah. So I mean, so Enrico Fermi was really the king of those kind of problems, and they're called Fermi problems often. So I mean, so those things. There's a lot of good books about how to do that in general. But I think what you said was correct. I mean, what you do is you try to break it down into smaller pieces that you can estimate, and you can just guess exactly. And I think one of the challenges in doing that is it's okay to be wrong, right? So it's okay to not get the answer exact. And you saw that sort of in the last lecture. We weren't getting, we didn't care about factors of 10, right? We only cared about, maybe a factor of 100 would be bad. And so I think it's the same thing with those puzzles. Is you break it down to the point where you can just write the answer down, and within factors of 10, and then build it up. And the other thing is that there's no correct way to do those puzzles, right? I mean, one person can break it down in a different way as opposed to another one, and it shouldn't really matter which way you break it down in the end. Again, we're within factors of up to 10, 30 or so. But yeah, so it's a fun thing to do, and it's also a way to really understand claims that people make when they say certain things are going to cost so much money or going to take so much time. You don't have to necessarily just believe them. You can try to get an estimate to see if it even makes sense within orders of magnitude. The kind of thing that we were doing 2 weeks ago was a little different because we were actually putting in the correct physics. Right? We put in these basic, this basic sort of like freshman physics that isn't, that also is not accurate within factors of 10, but it's only accurate within about factors of 10. But for a lot of the problems, that's enough. We don't care about being more accurate than that. So I really think this is the kind of thing that should be taught more, even high school students, because often we don't, if you're not an engineer, you don't really care about getting all the factors too correct. You just want some general idea for why things are the way they are. Okay, so maybe one more question about last week's lecture, and then we can get started. If everyone was happy with, that was probably the hardest lecture for me to put together because this whole Higgs mechanism is it's fundamentally quantum mechanical and it's very mathematical too. So, but hopefully, sort of got the gist of what's happening.
You said that at low speeds, the electric field predominates versus the magnetic field.
Right.
Does that mean at higher speeds the magnetic field predominates?
So if an electron is moving if an electron within an object is moving at a speed that's close to the speed of light, they'll have comparable strengths, interaction strengths.
The magnetic never exceeds the electric?
So it's in particular cases it can exceed it, and it also depends on. It's one of the questions about depends on who's asking. So it's one of the things like we saw with relativity. If someone is moving very quickly with respect to the speed of light, space and time can look different. And it's the exact same thing with electromagnetism. To somebody who's not moving, it may look just like an electric force, but someone who's moving may interpret the same interaction as a magnetic force. And so, you should think of them as really being different aspects of the same sort of thing.
Does that play a role in accelerators?
Yeah, I mean, all these effects are critical for accelerators. I mean, you have to get that stuff right. All right. So apologies again for not being able to be here last week. Hopefully you had a good lecture with Jamie. He sent me a draft, actually, of his slides before. It looked wonderful. It's a topic that I guess that it's unusual for this sort of series. So he talked, for those that weren't here, he talked about gerrymandering and how one might apply mathematics to deal with gerrymandering. And so, at first it looks like it's totally unrelated to what we're talking about here, but it actually fits in with the overall program. One of the big questions that, if you remember back to the first lecture, one of the questions that we wanted to answer was, why is it worth going to all this trouble to find the Higgs? Okay? And this is actually a question that has to be answered at the personal level, so you have to, answer the question for yourself. Why do you want to invest all this energy in doing something? And so you saw, hopefully you've seen hints of why you might want to do that. But it also has to be answered at the institutional level. So international governments and organizations, governments and international organizations also have to answer the question, why do we want to devote so many resources to this type of thing? One of the big reasons is people that are involved in solving these problems really have to develop technical proficiencies, state-of-the-art technology to answer very generic questions, right? And that's partly because we don't know what the answer is going to be ahead of time, and we don't even know what the questions that we might need to answer ahead of time are going to be. And so it's really, this business is really about training, or it results in training a workforce that's really able to deal with open-ended questions with cutting-edge technology. And as you can imagine, that's something that's also very valuable outside of the field. And so that's really one of the big reasons why governments are so keen to support this kind of science as well. And hopefully you saw that nicely with Jamie last time. Okay, but now we'll get back to the regular program of physics. So here's where we are in the schedule. For today's title is the Canon and the camera. But just might want to remind, because it's been a couple weeks, I'll remind people what we've built up to and where we are now. So I think 2 weeks ago we talked about the Standard Model, and this is really a description of everything around us. Okay, it's really a triumph of the 20th century. It combines principles of quantum mechanics and relativity that were triumphs of the early part of the 20th century into a more general theory that's called a quantum field theory. This is the way that any possible universe must behave if it obeys the principles of quantum mechanics and relativity. This was really something that came in the second half of the 20th century. And in particular, our particular universe, obeys these principles, so it has to be a form of the quantum field theory, and we went over the particular form that it takes. Okay, so we have matter particles. These are objects that behave like, the large collections behave like objects, so like bricks or baseballs or things. And they come in two forms, leptons and quarks. And we have these three families of them, which we don't really have a good understanding for. And all these particles have spin a half. So they're fermions. So this matter, and this makes up all the matter around us. And it also, and this matter interacts with itself, okay? And these interactions are dictated by principles of symmetry, where there's a lot of mathematics behind it that we didn't go into. But associated with each one of these interactions or forces is another particle, okay? And these are force carriers, they're bosons, they all have spin 1. And they behave, if you had large collections of these, they would behave classically like waves. Okay, so like light. And we saw that this, we said all these great things about this theory. It makes all these great predictions. It explains everything around us, blah, blah, blah. It gives us a consistent theory of the electromagnetic strong interactions. And this was all true provided that everything was massless. Okay? And this was actually a big problem because we know these things have mass. In particular, the W and the Z have a mass. And of course, the matter, the electrons, have a mass. And we saw the last lecture that this electron mass is really critical. It's critical to our, the size of atoms, the size of planets, the size of us. And so it's really, we know it has a mass, and that mass is really relevant in our everyday lives. Okay, so now it looks like we're doomed. With relativity and quantum mechanics, it was really about revolution, right? It was about taking the principles that we had before them and throwing them away, or really radically changing them. And so you might think that we're in this case again, right? We have a theory that makes no sense if there's mass, but there is mass, so maybe we have to throw everything out and start again. And that's where the Higgs came in. Okay, so the Higgs mechanism that we talked about, or the Higgs field actually, not the Higgs boson, but the Higgs field was added to the theory. It's actually kind of ugly, right? I mean, I presented it, it's, especially when you first see it, it's not so elegant, right? You add some theory, you had some field that's supposed to exactly solve this one problem. Okay, and you have to dictate that it has this shape. There's no, again, the only reason you say that is because you know that shape will solve the problem. But nonetheless, it works. Okay, so we add this new field to the theory. It allows these particles to have mass and to be in a consistent way. And you saw the idea here, right? So this is the energy of this Higgs field, and we just say it has this funny form that it costs energy to have no field. So the theory itself wants to sit here where it minimizes energy, and this has a non-zero value of the Higgs field. Okay, and this, we saw the implications of this last time. This leads that the electron being able to have mass in a consistent way. But it also leads to another particle. Okay, so because you have this field, you would generally expect that you can excite this field or have sound waves within this field, and that would be expected. Also, we saw that this other particle was needed for logical consistency. If you didn't have this particle, there were questions you could ask about the field or about the theory that would just give nonsense. Right? We saw these new omega particles that were needed for the W and the Z. Those could give probabilities that were bigger than 1 if they interact, right, without the Higgs boson. And that is a sign that the theory is breaking down. So we add this field to really solve the problem of the mass, and it predicts a new particle that's needed really for logical consistency, and that's what the Higgs boson is. Okay, and then we also talked that it's not, the theory is really making a sharp prediction. It's not that, oh yeah, there should be some new particle that you can see, but almost all the aspects of this particle are predicted by the theory. Okay, so in particular, it has to be, because of the way that this condensate gives mass to the particles, the Higgs boson itself has to have the same interaction. So for all matter, it has to have an interaction strength that goes like the mass of the particle, and same for the W and Z bosons. And then, we saw just quantum mechanics and relativity say there's only a few number of values of the spin that are possible, and by considering these interactions, we ruled out almost all of them. So not only does there have to be this new particle that has very precise interactions, it also has to have spin 0. And as we'll see in 2 lectures, we've never seen a spin 0 particle before, and there's actually a lot of problems, deep mysteries associated with spin 0 particles. We don't want to have them if we can avoid it, but it's really forced on us here. Okay, so at this point, the only thing that the theory isn't telling us is how massive this Higgs boson is. Okay, and so I've sort of been presenting this in a logically consistent way, but there's a rich history behind all of this. I thought I would just give a very brief summary of this sector of it. So in the late 60s is when the Standard Model has really taken its modern form. Okay, and in particular, it was able to explain interactions, the weak interactions. Okay, and it did this by predicting massive W and Z bosons. Okay, and as I mentioned, this was hard to swallow at first because the theory predicts that these things can't be massive. Okay, But nonetheless, this prediction was made. And then in the early 80s, this was discovered. Okay, this was discovered at CERN and a precursor to the LHC through processes that look like this. You would collide quarks, and they would make a Z-boson, a massive Z-boson or a W boson that was then observed by its decays to electrons in the detector. I'll talk about some of this in this lecture. Okay, so this was confirmed, and so now we really have this problem, in our face. Not only is the theory predicting that they have mass, they've been observed to have mass. So then there was a whole program to study these particles, the property of these guys, and in particular, you can measure the masses very precisely. And as we talked about, this quantum field theory predicts probabilities for certain things to happen, and it also predicts basic properties of the particles themselves. So we looked at diagrams that look like this, which would be a contribution to the mass of the Z boson or the W boson. And if you look here, this is the case where the Z boson turns into top quarks, okay, and then back into the Z boson, and this would change, modify the Z boson mass. And so actually, by measuring the Z boson mass very precisely, you can determine something about what's happening in this loop. And at the time, the top quark wasn't discovered; it was unknown. And so by measuring this very precisely and calculating these diagrams, so taking the theory very seriously, you would predict that there should be a top quark, and you could also predict sort of what properties it should have, so what its mass should be. This was all done in the early 90s. The top quark was then discovered, was seen directly at a lab outside Chicago, actually another precursor to the LHC. This was in 95. And everything was consistent. So here you see this is a function of year, which shown as the mass of the top quark. Okay, this is in GeV, so 100 times bigger than the proton. And you can see what was predicted in blue. This is from these diagrams like this. This is the prediction as it evolves. It gets better because these error bands get smaller because we're measuring it more precisely. And then in 95, we discovered the top quark right where we expected based on the theory. So it's really a whole. This was a vindication of this whole program of taking these quantum corrections seriously and using them to predict things that you haven't seen yet directly. Okay, so now that it's been vindicated, we can use it again, and that's what was done. So in particular, you can study now the mass of the top quark, and it turns out also you want to measure the mass of the W quark, W boson more precisely. And you could do the same game, and now you know what this mass is, and you can say something about the mass of the Higgs. So remember, the Higgs particle has to have these interactions with matter and with bosons. And so this was done. Okay, this was a whole program that happened in the early 2000s. And it led to a prediction that the mass should be somewhere between 50 GeV and 150 GeV. So if you'll remember from our basic considerations of when does the theory break down, when does the probabilities become bigger than 1, that predicted something like a TeV. And this direct thing is saying that it has to be even sooner. It has to be, you have to have a particle that comes in even earlier than the TeV. Okay, so now I'm going to sort of switch gears a little bit. We spent many lectures talking about the overall framework and the overall theory, what the Higgs boson is, and what the predictions are, where its mass should be, and properties. And now we're going to switch gears and discuss what it takes to test this theory, what it takes to confirm these, in practice. Okay, and so that brings us to today's lecture, the Canon and the Camera. So this is a title that comes from talking about particle physics to third graders. So on the first lecture, I said my only other previous public speaking is for third graders, so you had to cut me a break. But I meant that, and so I do these career days in Philadelphia, in some of the inner city schools, where you talk about sort of what it is that you could do when you grow up. Okay, and I do particle physics, and so I thought it might be good to start with the discussion that I give to the third graders, to sort of give a frame of reference, and then we'll refine this the rest of the lecture. Okay, so this is a slide that I start with for them. I say, really, we're asking basic questions of what everything is made of. You should recognize this guy from last week. So you can ask, what is everything made of? It turns out everything is made of molecules. Then what's the next question to ask? And they all know this. Okay, what are molecules made of? So these are made of atoms, and then now by this point they've caught on, and then the question is, what are atoms made of? One of the things is a proton. Then we can ask, what are protons made of quarks? And then the obvious question is, what are quarks made of? Okay, and that no one really knows. And so that's the big picture. And now you can ask, how do we go about studying this? And so we'll start with the more important question of what's for lunch. Okay, so what is in the lunchbox? And so there's a couple ways to determine that. The first way is to just open it. Okay, you can look inside and see what's in there. But this is no fun, right? It's kind of boring. The other way is more exciting. You can take two lunchboxes, you put them in cannons, and shoot them at each other. They will collide, they will smash, the lunchboxes will break apart, and whatever was inside the lunchbox will come flying out. Okay, this is a much more exciting way to do it. The problem here is, in order to break the lunchbox, these cannons have to be very powerful. So these lunchboxes hit each other at very high speeds, and this stuff comes flying out at high speeds. So we can't just look at it; we have to take a picture, and then we can study these pictures to see what came out. And so now, if we want to ask the question, what's inside of a proton? Protons are actually too small to just look inside, so we can't open them up and see what they're made of. So our only option is to smash them. Okay, and so that's exactly what we do. We have cannons that shoot them at one another. They collide. Stuff comes out very, very quickly, and we have to take pictures of it. So there's really two aspects of doing this. You have to have the cannon that smashes the things together, and you have to have the camera to take pictures of what comes out. Okay, and so we have the world's biggest cannon. Okay, so Philadelphia is here. They know the cannon is actually over here on the border of France and Switzerland. Of course, you guys know all this. Here's a picture of it on the map. It's very big. It's about the size of Philadelphia around, so it's enormous. So we have a big cannon. It's actually buried underground. Okay, interesting. For some reason, they think this is the greatest. This is the greatest part of the story. But it's like 300 feet underground, and protons go around both directions. So we have to have a big cannon, and we also have a very big camera. And so this is a picture of the camera. So you can see that it's enormous. This would be the size of a dinosaur relative to the camera. These are tiny things for people. And this is really a complicated thing, but you should just think of it as a giant camera. And what we do is we bury the camera underground as well, and we put it right in the middle of the two cannons, and so we shoot these protons at one another, they collide in the middle, and we take pictures of what comes out. Okay, an example of a picture looks like this. So the collision is happening in the center here, and all the stuff is coming out, and we take pictures that look just like this. Okay, so that's the sort of message that they get, and I actually think it's easier to talk about this than something like banking or an investment bank, because it's very much more abstract. So this explanation is essentially correct, right? I mean, this is really what we do, and this is sort of what we're after. There's some caveats, of course. I mean, we have a more sophisticated analog of what quarks are made of, right? So now we know that we're really testing this theory. This theory predicts that there's this other particle, blah, 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 blah. But it's not so far off, okay? And then the other caveat is, the stuff that comes out of the lunchbox isn't really there to begin with protons, right? We're exciting things out of the vacuum. Those are, caveats that I don't come into with the third graders. Okay, but this is, the basic concept and even the methods is something that anyone can really understand. And so I think this is something that's really great about this field, is that what we're after is really basic and intuitive. Some of the deep mathematical issues with the details, but the basic thing is relatively straightforward. Okay, so the rest of the lecture is going to be to refine the basic notions of the camera and the cannon, and I'll sort of talk about how physicists really think about these pictures that we're taking. Okay, and how we discuss them, and then I'll talk about some of the challenges in collecting and analyzing these pictures. So it's not as easy as just taking the pictures and looking at them, but I'll talk about things that complicate that basic picture, and then I'll end with a discussion about how we actually use these pictures to relate to the theory, to go back to the theory. Okay, so here's a more detailed picture of the Atlas detector. This is one of the big detectors that's in the LHC. But again, you can think of it as a big camera. Okay, and that's sort of how we do it. It's really made of a bunch of different systems. Okay, and I don't worry about what the systems are in detail, but there are really teams of people behind each one of these names. Okay, so I mean the way that I think most physicists really think of what the camera or what the detector records are these four basic outputs. Okay, so we have an inner part, and this is made up of a system of three different detectors, but essentially what this does is they measure the trajectories of charged particles that come out of the collision. Okay, so we have an inner tracking system that gives sort of the paths that a particle takes. And this whole tracking system is in a magnetic field, and so by looking at the curvature of how these particles move, we can measure how fast they're moving or their momentum. Okay, so that's one of the basic outputs. Then there are our system of what we call calorimeters that are very similar. There's electromagnetic calorimeter and hadronic calorimeter. These things, instead of measuring the trajectories, measure the overall energies of particles. So the inner detector or the inner tracking system doesn't stop the particles. The particles go through and just measures where they went. The calorimeters stop the particle. Okay, so they're basically made of a bunch of material. The particle hits it, it slows down, and the calorimeters heat up a little bit, and we measure how much they heat up, and that's directly related to the energy that the particles had. And there's two types. There's an electromagnetic calorimeter, and this is effective at stopping and measuring particles that have charge or they experience the electromagnetic interaction, so like a photon or an electron that stop. The hadronic calorimeter is good for stopping things that do not experience the electromagnetic charge. So like a neutron, for instance, is not charged, but it would be stopped in the hadronic calorimeter. And these things, one of the reasons these detectors are so expensive is we want to stop all the particles here. So that these particles are coming out at really high speeds, and you need a lot of stuff to stop them. And so these are actually pretty bulky. They're made of steel and heavy elements. Okay, and so almost everything gets stuck in these and measured in these things. There are muons that make it out. Okay, so muons interact very weakly with this material, and they get all the way out of it. And so all this stuff outside of this basic inner region is meant to measure the path of the muon. Okay, so it's very similar to what's done right in the center, except it's dedicated to doing the muons. And we know that things that make it out here are muons because everything else gets stuck. And so that's how we can tell it's a muon. Okay, now of course a lot of work goes into this. I mean, this is a simplistic representation of this. But I think even within the field, this is how we internalize it. Right? All the work goes into calibrating these objects, and then when we start thinking about physics or doing the analyses, we just take these as inputs. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. That's how I present. But this I think is really what we do. Okay, now of course we're not interested in these things, right? These things are certain types of pictures with detector measures. What we're really interested in are things in the standard model, right? We're interested in the particles that we talked about. And so by correlating the information in those four different basic outputs, we can infer which type of particle was created. And so I'll sort of walk through that here. So let's start first with the electron. So the electron is charged. Okay, so it will leave a trajectory in the inner tracking system. And it experiences the electromagnetic interaction, so that means it will stop in the electromagnetic calorimeter, and it will leave its energy there. The muon, as we said, doesn't get stopped by the calorimeter, so it is also charged. So it will leave a track in the inner part. It will leave very little energy in the calorimeters, and it will leave a track. It will make it all the way through the muon system, so it will look like this. Okay, so now it's clear how you can tell these two apart, right? If you saw a picture that looked like this, that would not look like a muon. So the towels are a little more complicated. This is a heavier version of the muon. Often it decays to electrons and muons, so it does that about half the time. And then we can't tell that then it just shows up as an electron and muon. But some of the times it can decay into pions. okay, into like a charged pion, and that would look like this. It is also charged, so it will have a trajectory in the inner tracker, and it will leave some of its energy in the electromagnetic calorimeter, and it will leave most of it in the hadronic calorimeter. So it would look more like this. Okay, so it would have a much higher piece in the hadronic calorimeter. Let's now move to the quarks. These all roughly look alike. Okay, these look like sprays of particles in the detector, so collimated sprays, and this is ultimately because of the effect that we talked about on the third lecture, that the strong force is increasing with distance. And so what this does is, as quarks come flying out, they actually pull quarks out of the vacuum, okay, and that leads to, instead of just having one quark, you get a spray of a bunch of different particles. And some of them are charged, some of them are not. The charged ones would leave trajectories that in the inner tracker, and almost all the particles will deposit their energy in the calorimeters. So we can infer that there's a quark because there's a whole spray of tracks that point to energy in the calorimeter. Okay, so now one of the big things in this game is telling these apart. Okay, so it's relatively easy to tell this guy apart from this guy, and certainly this guy is easy. But with tau, it becomes hard, right? If you miss some of these tracks, or some of these are hard to see, these start looking alike. Okay, so like I said, all of these essentially look the same. b-jets also look very similar, so b-quarks. However, they have the unique property that they're relatively long-lived. Okay, so a particle that has a b-quark in it will actually live for a little bit, and then it will do this jet thing. So then it will turn into spray particles. And to some extent, the c-quark does that. But so we can get some indication that it was a b-quark and not one of these other quarks by looking for a displacement here. Okay, the neutrinos do not interact at all with the detector, so we can't observe their interactions. But we can infer that there was a neutrino present because of momentum conservation. And so what we can essentially do is we can add up all the other things in the event, okay, and this should actually balance. And if you see a big imbalance, like in this picture, where all the energy is on one side, that we can infer from that there was something else that was on the other side. Okay, and that's how we really infer the presence of a neutrino. Now, of course, we can't tell if there's two neutrinos here, right? There could be two. All we know that there's at least some, and that they have the energy that's needed to balance this. Okay, and so these are really the basic things that we measure. Everything else is derived from these. I mean, in some sense, neutrinos are already derived quantities. But let's start with the top quark. So it decays immediately into other things, and one of the main ways we see it is by decays through a muon. So that's just this guy, a b-jet that looks like the jet with the displacement, and a neutrino. So there's some missing energy. So if we see a picture that looks like this, where we have one of these, and it looks like they're imbalanced, that's a good indication that there was a top quark present. And then so this is all the fermion or the matter particles. We can do play the same game for the bosons. So there's gluons. These look just like quarks for the most part. They're just sprays of charged particles, sprays of tracks that point to clusters of the calorimeter. Photons look a lot like an electron, except they don't have a charge. So it would look like a cluster in the calorimeter with nothing pointing to it. And that would be a sign of a photon. The W and the Z decay almost immediately to other particles. And the way that we really find them is by their decays to electrons or muons. And so one example, the W can decay to a muon and a neutrino, and that would look like this. So it's just a muon plus imbalance. It can also decay. This can also be an electron and a neutrino. And then the Z decays in a similar way, but to two charged leptons. So it can decay to two electrons, or it can decay to two muons. Okay, and then the same thing will be done with the Higgs, right? So we just build on this sort of iterative thing. So one of the ways, we'll talk about all this in the next lecture as well, but one of the ways that the most often way that Higgs decays is to pair B quarks, so that looks just like two of these B-jets. It can also decay to 2W bosons, and so those in turn decay, and so now you sort of chain these things together. So that can look like a muon, an electron, and missing energy. It can decay to 2 taus, so we can have, we can get a muon from a tau, or what we call the hadronic tau decay plus missing energy. It can decay to 2 Z's, which then decay to leptons, or it can decay to 2 photons, which we just saw. And so this is really the way that we think about the basic inputs. And so now we can come back to this picture that we looked at before, and now we can make more sense out of it. So let's start here. So this is, this inner part is the inner tracking system I talked about. This green thing is the electromagnetic calorimeter, and the red thing is the hadronic calorimeter. And so now you can see this guy looks like an electron, right? It has a bunch of energy in the electromagnetic calorimeter, not much energy behind it, and there's this trajectory that's pointed right at it. And so this is telling us that it's either, this energy is telling us it's either an electron or a photon. The fact that there's this track is telling us, or trajectory is telling us that it's an electron. Then we can go here. This is a muon. You can't really see it well, but there's a track in here, and it goes all the way through, and it's observed out here as well. So that's a sign that there was a muon in the event. Then there's two, and you can see what a jet looks like. So there's 2 of them here. There's these blue guys. They point to big energy is both in the electromagnetic and in the hadronic calorimeter. So that's a clear sign that there was a quark there, or a quark or a gluon. And then there's another one here. Okay, there's the yellow tracks. And actually, you can't see this from the picture, but if we would zoom in, very closely, there's a sign of displacement in both of these. So it looks like these are b-jets, and we say that those are b-tags. Okay, and then if we add up all the energy in this event, there's a significant imbalance, and that's that we call missing energy, actually, or NET. That's what that means. But there's imbalance that's shown by this dotted line. So this looks like there was the presence of at least 1 neutrino here. And so this is a good candidate for a TT bar event, where you would produce 2 W's, 2 b-jets. The W's could decay to electron, muon, and neutrino, and you would get 2 b-jets. So this is the sort of typical pictures and the typical objects that we work with. Okay, so now I'll say a few things about the experimental challenges in analyzing these pictures. So the first has to do with this b-jet identification. And so this is telling quarks that are b-jets from quarks that are not, or quarks or gluons that are not b-jets. And this is really important for the Higgs, as I mentioned before, and we'll see in more detail next week. The Higgs decays often to b-jets, so it's important to be able to see these in the detector. Right, so we talked about the fact that, here's a more detailed picture of what these, or more detailed cartoon of what these might look like. So here's a b-jet here. You can see that, as I said, the b-jet can live some distance before decaying to other things. So in this cartoon, this is the interaction point. So this is where the protons collide, and you can see that there's this displacement before the b-jet turns into these other particles, as opposed to the regular jet. So this would be like a jet from a light flavored quark or from a gluon. These things right away decay to the other particles. And so the critical thing about identifying if something is a b-jet is to see that these guys don't start at the interaction point. Okay, there's a number of ways of doing that. So we have algorithms that they're really almost like vision algorithms that are run. They're pretty sophisticated. You can try to match these all up to a point in space. That we call finding a displaced vertex. Okay, the other thing we can do is we can take the paths that these take and extrapolate them backwards, and we can see that they miss this interaction point. Right? So if they really started from here and you extrapolate it backwards, they'll run into it. But if there's some displacement, then very often you'll miss it. So those are some of the ways that we can do this. And just to give you some sort of feeling for the scales involved in the problem, these B quarks or the particles that have the B quarks in them have a lifetime of picoseconds, so that's 10 to the minus 12 seconds, which is not very big. But because they're coming out with such speed, and there was this effective time dilation that we talked about earlier, these things actually travel millimeters. So this distance is like a couple millimeters. And that really means that we have to be able to, if we want to be able to tell that this is a significant, statistically significant difference, we have to really be able to measure this sort of vertex with a precision of like 10 microns. Okay? And so this is really driving the specifications on the detector resolution, trying to find these b-jers. And this is one of the reasons these detectors are so expensive, right? You have this thing that's the size of the apartment building that's got to measure distances down to tens of microns. Okay? So you can imagine that's challenging and expensive to do. Incidentally, it also means that we have to know the positions of these detectors to better this accuracy, right? Because we're taking pictures, but we're relying on the location of the camera to reconstruct everything. And so we have to know where we put the cameras to within about a micron, which is also very hard to do. And there's a lot of interesting computational problems with doing that. Okay, and this is what I said here. We have these giant detectors that have to measure very accurately positions. And it turns out this is something that's just barely visible to the human eye. But this is really a major cost driver in these systems. Okay? Especially the cameras that are in the inner part of the detector have to be very precise in their measurements. Okay, another thing that's a really major complication is something that's called triggering. And I'll explain what that means. So this is needed for two basic reasons. One is that the Canon or the LHC provides orders of magnitude more pictures than we can save to disk. Okay, so it's doing this much more often than we have disk space to write the pictures to disk. And you'll see what the numbers are in a second. So we can't save everything. We have to choose which to keep. And the interesting pictures are incredibly rare. Okay? Most pictures are totally uninteresting. And so we can't save everything, and we can't just keep things at random. We have to make the correct decision. So that's a big problem. And so just to put a scale on this, we can only keep about one picture out of 40,000 pictures. Okay, so we have to throw almost everything away. And anything that's discarded, all this data or these pictures that are discarded are really lost forever, so we can't get them back. So we have to make the right, we have to pick this one out of 40,000 correctly. And here's an example that what I mean by interesting physics is incredibly rare. We only make one Higgs boson per billion events. Okay, so it's really important that we choose this one correctly. Okay, so this is why we have this. This is a big problem, okay, or a big challenge. And triggering is the way that we meet this challenge. And so basically what triggering refers to is the process of selecting which of these 40,000 events to keep. So which to write to disk to save for further analysis. Okay, and so the way that we do this within Atlas and also the other similar experiments is also a cost driver to the experiment. So we have to do this using a lot of custom electronics that run very quickly. So the idea is we look at all these 40,000 pictures very quickly, so within microseconds, and we decide whether or not they might be interesting. And then if they pass a certain threshold of being maybe interesting, then we look at them more closely with more commodity CPUs that also run sort of in real time. So this is running, we make the decision whether or not to keep an event within really microseconds after taking it. And so this amounts to really doing this image processing or developing these photographs very quickly. So in microseconds for these custom electronics, and then within seconds for the commodity CPUs. So this is also a very interesting challenge, and it's something that we've really been ahead of the game on in a lot of industry. So a lot of industry also wants to make fast decisions, but they typically have more time to run these algorithms than we have at the LHC. And in terms of it also has to run at a very high rate. So the input rate or the number of collisions that we're getting is 40 million per second, and we can only keep about 1,000 per second. So that sort of gets a scale on this. And then I think the really interesting one, or the real fundamental limitation is this one. If we kept every event, or if we kept every picture, that would be 80 terabytes per second, okay, which is ridiculously large. Like a big library like the University of Chicago, if you took every book there, it would be about 10 terabytes. Okay, so this is 10 times that per second, okay, so which is just ridiculously large, bigger than Google, Facebook, any of that. And we have to deal with this and get this down to like 2 gigabytes per second, which is also ridiculously large, but this is something that we're able to cope with actually. So this is a big challenge. A lot of work goes into this, and you have to get it right, right? If you screw this up, you're dead because you missed the interesting thing. And as I said, this is another really major cost driver. This is why these things cost so much money. This is also why people are very interested in working on them. Okay, so there are a bunch of other experimental challenges, of course, but these are really I think are the major ones. They're also the ones that I worked on. But now I'll talk about the canon. I'm not going to say too much about this, partly because I don't work on this and on the details of this. But it's really fascinating. There's a lot of equally fascinating problems behind getting this right too. And I encourage you guys to request lectures on this as well. But so I'll just give my sort of or some of the physicist that works on the detector's perspective. Okay, so basically, most of the time these protons miss each other. Okay, so it's hard for these guys to line them up so that you get a hit. It's also quantum mechanical, so even if you have lined them up, there's only some probability that they'll hit each other. But basically, you can't aim with enough precision. So the way that we get around this is instead of colliding protons, we collide bunches of protons. So if we have many protons together, collide them, and then the probability that one of them or some of them hit is high. Okay, so that's what's done. So we collide bunches of very tightly packed protons to ensure that some of them hit. And at the LHC, we're able to get 10 to the 11 protons per bunch. So it's really a lot. I mean, this isn't a solid or anything. It's still like almost like you think of it as a gas, but it's quite a lot of protons. And then the other, so that's one point that we collide bunches of them. And then, of course, as we talked about, protons aren't fundamental particles themselves. They're made of other things. So when these collide, really what we're interested in is the collision of one of these guys, so like a quark with a quark, or an anti-quark with a quark, or gluons with each other. So not only do we have to worry about the probability for a proton hitting, but we have to understand in some detail what's happening inside the proton. So what are the probabilities for these things to collide? And this is what's shown here. So this is a whole industry in and of itself, but basically I'll just summarize what this is. This is showing the different things that are within a proton. So the different up quarks, down quarks. These are anti-up, anti-down. These are the other quarks, and these are gluons. This is like the probability to find one of these within a proton in any given collision as a function of the fraction of the energy that it has. Okay, so if you say that you want to take, one of these and it has almost all, it has half the proton energy, that's some probability. If it only has 10% of the proton energy, that's a different probability. And so that's what's shown on this axis. So x is the fraction of the proton energy that it has. So this is having all of, there's very little probability for any of these things to have all the proton energy. And as you go to smaller energy, you get higher probabilities. And so when we say that the proton is made up of 2 up quarks and a down, what we really mean is that if you ask the question, what's the probability that something is carrying most of the proton energy, then it's twice as likely for an up quark as for a down quark. Okay, so these have high probabilities here, where these other things are very small probabilities. And this is reflecting the fact that we say that a proton is really 2 up quarks and a down quark. If you made this, we also have these curves for neutrons, then you'd get different. These would look different. 2 downs and an up. Okay, but you can see that. So if you're asking for significant fractions of the proton energy, it's mostly in these up quarks and down quarks. But if you're willing to live with a smaller fraction of the proton energy, then you can have other things. Okay, you can have antiquarks. So let's see, these pink lines. These are the antiquarks. This is coming from these pairs here, and you can also have gluons. Right, so it's these guys, and the gluons actually dominate at low energy. So this is the gluon probability here, and this is divided by 10. Okay, so when you're really below like a percent of the proton energy, that's almost all gluons. So you should think of really high energy proton collisions is really just a bunch of gluons. and with some, with some quarks. Okay, so all these distributions, okay, and what's made of a proton is really something that in principle can be calculated from theory. So this is all you can put in, what we talked about with the strong force, how it changes with distance. One can do the calculations in principle, okay, and predict what these things should be. In practice, these calculations are extremely hard to do. It's mainly because the force gets so strong that it's really hard to calculate anything with high precision. And so in practice, what we do is we extract these distributions from data. Okay, there was a lot of dedicated experiments to do this before the LHC that ran in Germany that was able to measure these things very precisely. And so those are really needed for making sense of the LHC collisions. So it's really, the work that's being done at the LHC is really something that's relied on, work that's come from generations before it. Okay, so that's sort of the basic, that's the basic idea. We collide these protons, we know what the probability to have a quark or a gluon is out of them, and that gives us these pictures. Okay, so now what do we actually measure? So we measure, everything's quantum mechanical, so we can only talk about probabilities. So what we measure is the probability for a certain process to happen. Okay, and this is actually given in terms of an area. Okay, and that's a funny unit. I'll kind of explain why. So because these things are running so often, what we actually measure is a rate, an event rate. So how many of a certain type of picture do we see per second? Okay, this is something that we can directly measure with our experiment. And this event rate that we observed is related to the particle flux. And so this is something that's known as an input from the LHC. So we know how many protons per cross-sectional area are colliding. Okay, so we know the number of protons. This is like 10 to the 11 for the area that's like the size of the beam, and we know how often they collide. So this is something that we understand, but just by the basic way that we're running the LHC. And so this particle flux is related to a certain type of picture based on the cross section for something to happen. Okay, and so it has units of area because this guy depends on area. This is a number per second. But this is directly related to a probability. Okay, and so I'll try to explain and this is really the connection to the theory. So this cross section is, like I said, is a connection to theory that can be calculated from the theory by the methods that we talked about here, actually. So what it is it's proportional to the amplitude for something to happen. So you take a particular process. This has an amplitude of incoming particles with certain incoming quarks or gluons with certain energies. Okay, and they're given by, I wrote them here as x, that's like the fraction of the proton energy, which is known. This is the amplitude that we talked about in quantum mechanics, right? That we talked about in the second, third lectures. And so you take this probability and multiply it by the probability that these guys have that energy of the protons. Okay, so this is something, in more detail. This is the result of the calculation of these diagrams that we talked about. Okay, and then this thing is what we just talked about. These are the probabilities for the flying a quark with a certain energy within the proton. So if this involves a quark with 10% energy with another quark with 10% energy, then you need the probability that this thing will happen times the probability that the collision had that in the first place. Okay, so again, it's a combination of these two basic inputs. But once you know this from these other measurements that I talked about, this is known from theory, then this is predicted from theory. Okay, so you can definitively predict what event rate you should observe by this type of calculation. And then I'll just say a few things about units here. So it's an area, okay, but we quote them in funny units. So we say that they're barns, okay, and this is something that you can blame Enrico Fermi for. So he was studying nuclear physics, right, on this campus, actually. And one of the things that he was worried about was propagation of neutrons. So he wanted a neutron for reasons that are interesting, but I won't talk about here. You worry about neutrons moving around, okay? And in particular, you don't want them to bump into things like uranium. at a uranium atom, and that happened all the time, or it happened too often. And so Fermi was joking that uraniums are so big it's like hitting a barn. Okay, barns are the broadside of a barn, and so that's where this joke started, and that's what it's called. So a barn is the cross section or the probability for a neutron to hit a uranium atom, or a radionucleus rather, and so that's given by this sort of thing. And you can work out, just by dimensional analysis, the kind of thing that we did last week, then what the probability in this unit would be for two protons to interact. Right? If this is a barn, and this is made of 238 protons, okay, so a neutron is just like a proton, it's roughly the same size. Well, this thing is just just a bunch of the protons together. And so you can work out the geometrical factor, or you can calculate what the radius is. The radius goes like a cube of the number of things that you have, and then the area goes like the square, so you get this 2/3 factor. And so, anyways, you don't need to worry about this, but this is sort of how we remember it. But so these are the units we use, and so the area of the proton interacting, we say, is about a millibar. So that sort of can set the overall scale for the numbers that we'll see in coming lectures. Okay, and of course, the real units you should use here are GeV, of course, you all now are experts on that. Okay, so that's sort of how we can get to the theory. Now, what do we actually measure? So really, what we do on the fundamental level is we just count the pictures. Okay, we call certain pictures events. So we count the number of events that we see, and we select them with a particular signature. So we say, I'm only going to look at events that have 2 b-jets and some number of leptons, say, like the picture that we saw before. And then we can relate that to the theory, right? And so here's how we do this. The prediction of this, the number of events that we should see, is the probability of seeing an event times the size of the data set, so how many total pictures or how many total collisions there were. And so that's just written here. We write the total size of the data set with this L, the total luminosity. Okay, but it's really just the total number of events. And we just saw how to calculate this from our basic amplitude and the probability within the proton. And then what we measure is we just count the number of events. Okay, and so this is another complication that I won't talk about in detail. But if we observe so many pictures, that doesn't mean that all the pictures that we observe are the ones that we're after. Okay, so we're really after the number of top quarks, say. But there are some pictures that are not top quarks that can look like top quarks. And so really the number that we measure is the sum of the things that we're actually interested in, plus what we call background pictures, or things that have images that are very close to what we're looking for, but they're not exactly what we're after. And so this is actually what most of the field worries about, trying to understand how you measure this very precisely. This one is easy to measure. Getting an estimate for this uses a lot of tricks and a lot of data analysis to do that. So there's a lot of interesting algorithms and things that happen here. But I'll just take this as an input that we can derive. Okay, and then what we do is we report measured probability. So we report what cross sections we measure. This gives the probability, and then this thing can be directly compared to theory. Okay, so you remember that from this equation, the number of events is just this probability times the total data set. So the measured probability is just the data set, the number of events that we see divided by the data set, and that's what's shown here. So this is the number of signal events that we're after. Is just the number that we see minus this background. Okay, that's what's shown here. That's like the number of signal events, and then if we divide by the total data set size, that gives us this unmeasured cross-section. Okay, so that's sort of the thing that can be directly compared to the theoretical calculation. And here you see examples of that. Okay, so this is really, this is like the output of the experiment. Okay, so again, you can see how amazing this whole machinery is. So what's shown here is these are cross-section values. Okay, in picobarns. So this is 10 to the minus 12 barns, these funny units that we just saw. And you can see a whole bunch of different types of processes. So these are types of pictures that are seen, converted into this unit as we just went through. And so there's for each of these, there's a couple things. Maybe it's easier to see down here. So these colored bands are what we actually measure. Okay, so those are the measured values. And then there's these gray bands are the prediction from the theory. Okay, and you can see over many orders of magnitude here the comparison between what we measure and what we predict. And it's essentially dead on. I mean, there's almost no deviations here. There's some here, but there are large uncertainties. This is sort of what you might expect from measurements. So this is, again, is marvelous, shocking that it gets it this way. Okay, but this is really the output. This is really what these experiments do. They count these pictures, and then we can relate them directly to the theory by the calculations, just like we saw. Okay, so maybe I'll just end here. And so the next step is really to talk about how we take these pictures to look for the Higgs, and that's what the next lecture will be all about. But I just want to end here with showing the advantage of high energy. So everyone says, oh yeah, we're going to higher energy. We want to go, we want to increase the energy of the LHC. We want to build a high energy collider. And so I'm going to just walk through how you can see that that's really important to do. Okay, so this is the equation that we just looked at before. The number of events of some signal is the cross section for that signal. That's just some property of the theory times the data set size. Okay, this is the property of the theory and these probabilities within the proton times the data set size. And so now if I take a ratio of the number of events at a higher energy to a lower energy, so the LHC recently essentially doubled the energy. So now we're running at 13 keV. Before we were running at 8 keV. So we can see how big of an effect that would have. And so this equation holds for both energies. I'll just divide the two. So we see the ratio of 13, number of signal events at 13 of higher energy to the 8 keV. That is just dividing these two things, right? So there's the cross section of the 13 keV divided by the cross section of 8, and then there's the luminosities, okay, or the data set sizes. And so this thing now just depends on how much data you collect with the two different energies, how many pictures you take. And this is about 10 with the current data set size. So we've run at the higher energy about 10 times longer, or we've taken 10 times more pictures than we have at the lower energies. But this is something that's sort of fixed and it grows linear. So as we take more energy, this will get bigger. Or when we take more data, this will get bigger, but it will grow just exactly with the amount of data that we take. But the other interesting thing is this ratio, the ratio of cross sections. And so you can see that here. So this is nonlinear and it can have a huge effect. So what's shown here is the ratio of a cross section at 13 to 8 as a function of like the mass of the particle that you're producing, say. And so the first thing to note is that it's always above 1. Okay, but if you're at very high energies, it can be significantly above 1. So for instance, we'll talk about in 2 lectures, there's reasons to think that the LHC might produce something new, some new particle that's heavier than things that we've seen before. And if it does that at 1.5 TeV up here, then this luminosity ratio is 10. So this ratio is 10. So effectively, the number of events that we would have at 13 TeV is 100 times the number that we would have at 8, despite the fact that we only have a data set that's 10 times bigger. So you can see that this factor here is really what we're gaining at high energy. Okay, and then similarly, if we're looking for something that's 3 TeV, then this is even bigger. Then this ratio is like 50, and despite only having a factor of 10, the bigger data set, the number of signal events is about 500 times bigger. Okay, and of course, this also helps us produce the Higgs as I mentioned briefly. We think the Higgs, we thought before that the Higgs would be sort of in this range, and even here there's an increase. It's not as big as if you're at very high energy, but here it's about 2.3, so we expect about 20 times the number of Higgs events at 13 TeV than we would get at a lower energy. Okay, so fundamentally this shape, or this cross-section ratio, is the real reason we want to go to higher energies, because it allows us to collect more signal events more quickly. Okay, so this lecture was sort of about the basics of what we're doing with these cameras. We'll come back next time and we'll pick up on how discuss how we use these tools specifically to discover and to study the Higgs boson, and how we can relate it to the things that are predicted just from the theory.
particles going in all of space, homogeneous molecules, and also does the Higgs particle, is it stable?
So the first question was, does the Higgs field permeate all of space? The answer is yes, it does. And then the second question was, does the Higgs particle decay right away? And the answer is yes, it decays almost instantly. We'll talk about that in more detail next lecture. Question here?
Yeah, I have a question about the triggering mechanism with detectors. So it's constrained pretty much by theory. It's conformal. Your expectation, I mean, certain events are expected by theory. So it seems as if, how do you detect something that's not predicted by theory? It seems like you have to discover it has to be predicted by theory rather than by actual observation.
Yeah, so this is a great question, and it's one that we really worry about a lot. And so the question is, isn't there a catch-22? Because you can only keep a small fraction of all the events, and so you have to decide ahead of time what events to keep, and then those are the only events you can analyze, so aren't you biasing yourself? And that is totally true, and we're very worried about that. And so one of the things that we try to do to mitigate that is we say we're only going to keep events that satisfy very general features. So one example is there's reasons to think that interesting physics is high energy, and so we say we keep events that have a lot of energy in them. And so we don't care about the particular shape of the energy it's in or the particular form it's in, but if there's a lot of energy, we keep that in there. We also do things like we say if it has an electron, we keep it. It turns out that the rate of those events is close enough to us. We can get away with those type of things. And then we also have a subset of the things where we know what we're looking for. So for the Higgs, we have a pretty good idea of what it's decaying to. So there we really have a targeted set of triggers, but it's really a menu. And so some of the types of pictures that we say are very dedicated reasons, and we try to keep some space for things that are unknown. But it's really hard to do. And maybe I'll come back to this in the last question. I mean, one of the things is we haven't seen anything. I mean, it's giving it away a little bit. And one of the worries is exactly this. Maybe we're producing new things, exciting things constantly, and we're just throwing them all away. And that's something that you really need to think about and need to worry about. But that's a great question.
So if you're producing 40 megahertz of events and you're capturing 1 megahertz, why not detune the accelerator to produce only 1 megahertz and capture all of them?
Yeah. So we're producing 40 megahertz, and we're keeping a kilohertz. Right. And so we'll answer this question directly next week. But basically, if you can get the right answer, then your effective data set size is much bigger. Right? If you can only keep, if you can always make the right answer, then you don't care about the events you're throwing away. Right? And so you want that input rate to be as high as possible. So like you can think of it, you only care about the total number of Higgses. If your efficiency for saving Higgses is 100%, then you only care about the total number of Higgses you produce, and you want that number to be as high as possible. So we want it to be higher than 40 megahertz if possible. If we reduce the rate to only the events that we can keep, our data set size would go down. So our data set size would go down by a factor of 40,000, and that means the number of signal events that we have, because that equation, signal events is cross-section times data set size, will also go down. So we really want to keep the input rate as high as possible. I mean, in an ideal world, the input rate would be as high as possible. We would select events with perfect fidelity, and we would maximize the number of signal events. And so it's definitely a trade-off. It can get to the point where, and we'll see this also in the next lecture, running at these very high rates causes problems, and that can make the efficiency go down. And so we think that if the LHC can even give us more events than we can cope with now, and we actually want them to tune down to 40 megahertz. So they could probably go higher in a certain sense. That will be clear later. And so we're doing this a little bit now, what you suggested, a little bit now. But it's a trade-off. We want to keep the product of those two numbers high, not just one individually.
But if you're looking for unknown events, isn't it you want to capture all of them in tune, and then you will see something that's never been seen before?
Yeah, I mean, so we want to keep what we want to maximize is the number of signal events that we keep. Okay? And so we could do that in two ways, by maximizing the efficiency to keep an event, or maximizing the number of events that are produced originally. And so it's a trade-off between maximizing the efficiency. We can make the efficiency 1, but that would make the total number, input number, smaller. We've designed this trigger system cleverly, or we think cleverly, that we can keep most of the interesting things. So we prefer to throw away, we make the input number very big and throw away the stuff that we know or we think isn't interesting.
Are the slave calculators permitted to speak with each other so they get a big picture, or are they just isolated?
The trigger?
No, the slaves, the calculator, the postdocs.
Yeah, so, right, so so this is a good question. So the idea is, in all this business, there's an inherent bias, right? When we don't know, when we haven't seen the Higgs yet, everyone wants to believe that the Higgs is there, and we're counting these events, and we have to make decisions on which events to keep, which events not to keep, and you worry that there's some bias that's put in, either maliciously by someone wanting to be famous, or just subconsciously, like, there's a lot of ways you can introduce bias. And so there's two sort of ways that we do to mitigate this. One is we have two separate teams of slaves, okay, and they aren't allowed to talk to each other. So in principle, they're not allowed to talk to each other. So there's this whole camera that I described. There's actually two of them, and there's teams of physicists associated with each of those. And the idea is that they don't talk to one another, okay, and they do the experiment, and they count the number of pictures, and they should get the same answer, okay. So that's one of the ways, is you do it twice. The other way is that you keep internally within one collaboration or with one camera, you do the analysis in a way that you blind yourself from the result. So you try to remove bias by setting up all the criteria to select events ahead of time. So you're allowed to discuss with one another what is the optimal way to either calculate the number of background events or to select the different pictures. You do that ahead of time before you look at the data. And in that way, you're allowed to discuss and talk to one another and still keep it unbiased. But I mean, this can be a big challenge, especially you're relying on people to be fair, and there's a lot of pressure, especially from theoretical collaborators, to get the answer before we're ready to make an official statement.
In regards to this bias, is artificial intelligence used in deep learning?
Right.
To where it would make the observations to sort of negate some of the bias?
Yeah, so the question is about the bias. Is there artificial intelligence algorithms that are being run to negate the bias? So this is something that the field is just sort of starting to come to grips with. So we now run a lot of machine learning or more intelligent algorithms to try to make our decisions more fair and more optimally. And the thing is that these things are they can be biased as well. So they can be biased in a way that's much less transparent than something that's not as fancy. And so the field is trying to come up with ways to gain the benefits of these algorithms in a way where we can clearly understand the bias. And that's something that we do, and we think we have good ways to do that. But it's a challenge with these algorithms. We don't use the algorithms themselves to measure the bias or to remove the bias, but we use them to try to make smarter decisions, like which events to keep using these algorithms. And we worry that those are biased in ways that we don't really understand.
It's because we don't understand deep learning? Is that the problem?
The question was, is it because we don't understand deep learning? It's because deep learning is much more complicated than it's not a matter of saying, this question that was over here, aren't you worried that you're missing things you don't know about? Is much harder to say no to if you're using some black box. So maybe we'll come back. There's one up here.
Yeah, first specific question. So the cross-section has nothing to do with an actual geometry cross-section. It's just a product of units. So and what kind of machine learning can you run in a back-of-the-envelope calculation 400 clock cycles about, for instance?
So I'll do the first one first. So the question was, does the cross-section really have anything to do with area? In the classical limit, it does. If you turn off quantum mechanics or you turn off interactions, say, then if you have a bunch of particles hitting each other, the probability that if you can't really aim them that well and there's a distribution here and there's a distribution here, the probability that they'll meet is related to their cross-sectional areas. So in the limit that they just interact by bumping into each other, it's exactly this cross-sectional area. Of course, it's complicated here because these things have interactions that don't have to meet at the exact same point. There's quantum mechanics, etc. But there's definitely a classical analog. And then the second question was about clock. I missed something.
Yes, I've just calculated the back-end level of the calculation. That it would be something around 400 clock cycles per event. How did you do machine learning in that time?
Right.
So yeah.
So I didn't talk about this here, but the way the trigger system works is there's really two stages. There's a stage where we make very quick decisions without any of these fancy machine learning, and this is even without any CPU. So it's all custom electronics on detector that's running at dedicated FPGAs or ASIC chips that have been built specifically for this purpose, and that runs in order of microseconds. And these are really simple, stupid algorithms that get the event rate down to about 100 kilohertz. So 100 kilohertz is the rate at which we can then put this into a CPU farm. And then in the CPU farm, we have about a second for each event to process. And so it's also hard to process the whole event in a second. So what we do is we ask these very fast algorithms that run tell us what regions of the picture are interesting, and we develop those regions in detail, and that's where we run the algorithms. But these deep learning algorithms. So it's a challenge to not only come up with the algorithms to make the decisions correctly, but also to run them in a way that fits within this bandwidth. But that's a really good question.
What was the meaning of the independent variable x or x1 and x2?
Right. So when we say x, we mean the fraction of the proton energy. So, for instance, if you want to have two quarks hitting at a TeV, and they're coming from protons at 7 TeV, x would be 1/7. And so, the reason why we do this is because we measure these. As I said, we measured these probabilities, and we measured that at lower energies and at slightly different processes. And we actually use theory to relate the measurements at lower energies to the measurements at high energies, and it's written in this form, a fraction of the proton energy.
With our knowledge that we have today of particle physics, do we know the theoretical limit of which we will no longer raise the energy level of cyclotrons because there's no possibility of anything being out there?
Yeah, so the question is, based on the theory we have now, do we know that there's an upper limit to which we can raise the energies of these machines? The answer is yes, and that will be, I'll talk about this in the third lecture. This actually has deep implications for all of physics. And there's a lot of mysteries associated with this, and we think that space-time doesn't make sense because there is this limit. Okay, so maybe one more question back there.
This is quite simple. Back to high school. Still the screen up there. I'm not quite sure I understand this idea of the ratio between theory and the observed data. The numbers sigma 13 and sigma 8, which is the ratio of the theory over the observed.
Right, well, so this is just theory to theory here. This is, you can think of this as just theory to theory. So this is the number that the theory predicts. The number of signal events that the theory predicts is this theoretical cross-section times the data set size. And so what we want to know is how many more events that we'll get at the higher energy. This can either be predicted or observed. But the number of events at the higher energy goes like this ratio. But these curves both come from these curves come from theory plus the probabilities that have been measured. Okay, so I think we'll end there. So next week we'll talk about what it took to discover the Higgs and what we know about the Higgs now, what we're learning about it. Then we'll talk about, in the last two lectures will be problems with the standard model. Okay, and then the last lecture will be about where we go